Okay, I'm showing five people tuned in, so we'll commence here. We are going to continue and hopefully finish up Genesis chapter 30 this evening. Um, see. Good evening, Sherry. Uh, Before we kind of get into some new territory here in Genesis chapter 30, let's look at verses 22 and 23, and go ahead and look at 24 as well, and kind of tie up this depiction of rivalry between Leah and Rachel before we get in and rejoin the rivalry between um, Jacob and Laban. Reagan and Tammy are here, and that's good. So again, we're in Genesis chapter 30. We're going to revisit verses 22 through 24 before we getting into the brand new material. Verse 22 of Genesis chapter 30. Then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived a son, and conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. She named him Joseph, saying, May the Lord give me another son. Okay, so we looked at, hello, Petey and Robin. We looked at, last week at the workings of um, Leah and Rachel as they strive to kind of build their legacies through the only way a woman really had that opportunity to do so, to build their legacy, to leave their mark in the world, which is to be a mother, and so therefore they need to have sexual access to their husband, and the kind of whimsical story, I guess you could say, of the mandrakes and all of that. But we see the rivalry playing out for um, not just making their own way in the world, but doing it to gain status or favor above the sisters, each sister above the other one. Um, Rachel kind of has that status because she is the favored wife. Leah strives to attain it through children. Leah's success in bearing children inspires anger and resentment in Rachel. Rachel gives um, Jacob her maid as a wife, much like Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham, and counts the child and as her own, and both children, both sons that are born through the slave woman. And then Leah sees that at work, and then goes and gives her slave to Jacob in the same manner, and claims those sons as well as hers. And then Leah has some more sons. Finally, after all of this is done, after there are 10 sons and a daughter, uh, Rachel conceives a child of her own, a son of her own, Joseph, and it's born. And he is really the favored son. Rachel's already looking forward to the next one, but he is the son in whom Jacob is well pleased and is willing. Eventually, it can be seen in this context of this story as the motivation for Jacob to earnestly attempt to return to his family, to his home. Now that he's had Joseph, it's time to get away from his in-laws and return uh, back to the place he belongs, and taking his family there with him. But before we get into that and those negotiations and that interaction with Laban that Jacob has, just a couple of last words about the rivalry between the sisters. This is uh, one of the inspirations or origin story behind a particular law of Moses, Leviticus chapter 18, verse 18. There, It was forbidden for a man to marry two sisters. Men were allowed to have, I guess, as many wives as they cared to, and could afford to have, to pay the bride price for, and keep in their home and hearth. But you were allowed to have more than one wife, but they just couldn't be sisters to one another. And we see um, in this story kind of maybe some of the rationale why. And that's in a sense very particular to the construct of polygamy. Hi, Vicky. Good to see you here. Hope Terry's doing okay out on the road. So it's in a sense this story is very particular to the practice of polygamy, of having multiple wives, and what happens when you add on top of that the challenge or the complexities that are attendant to the two of the wives being sisters. In that sense, it is particular. It is, I think, more universal. The story becomes universal when you see the fact that Jacob was from a household, his family of origin had pretty severe issues with favoritism between the siblings. Isaac favoring Jacob, or excuse me, Esau. Isaac favored Esau, and Rebekah favored Jacob. Jacob is a product of that dysfunction in his family, and now in his own nuclear family, the family he creates, there is also the dysfunction of favoritism. It begins with the favoritism between the wives, but it will also, of course, visit into the relationship Jacob has with his sons. He most definitely has favorite sons, and they're Joseph and Benjamin, because they were born to Rachel, rather than all the other sons that are born to Leah and the slave women. So the favoritism of Jacob's family of origin is visited upon Jacob's created nuclear family, the wives and children that he has, and the complications that go along with that. And the law is attempting to kind of perhaps mitigate against that, because you don't have sisters, you don't add family rivalry into that. But at the same time, I mean, if you have multiple wives, I would think it would be very difficult not to have a favored one, or at least for the wives to perceive that one is favored over the other. And they would probably be accurate in that assessment. So there is this difficulty of the family thing intertwined into that, but there's also just this practice of favoritism and how that poisons a family, a nuclear family, when one spouse, or in our case, hopefully it's not multiple spouses, but in one, if there is a child that is favored discernibly toward the other children discern that their sibling is favored over them, there can be a lot of problems with that. And it gets the sins of the parents are visited really upon the children. They reflect the brokenness of their home of origin, their family of origin, rather than transcending it. And that makes the story, I think, kind of more or less universal. It's either something that if you can look at favoritism and see that in your family, maybe that resonates with you. But also, more generally speaking, whatever flaws, whatever dysfunction your nuclear family had, and every nuclear family has some form of dysfunction, but whatever dysfunction your nuclear family had, there is a very real risk that you will bring that into your own family that you create. You bring the sins of your parents into your own reality, into the life that you create for yourself and the lives you create with your spouse. So it's not that always requires intensive therapy or anything like that, but it's something to be aware of. something to try to guard against, something to try to transcend, but at the same time have the humility and the honesty. Hopefully, in every generation, hopefully every family can look and say, well, we had our strengths. There was good things about our family, but there were also some weaknesses. Here's some of the things that we were not so good at. Hopefully, our descendants can be better than that. Hopefully, our descendants can grow and improve on that. And our dysfunction will not be uh, passed down through inheritance for eternity, but to some extent, it probably is. But we see this happening here in this family. One flaw in the family of Isaac and Rebekah is a flaw that is reflected in Jacob's family, his relationship with his wives and his relationship with his, if you know the story, of course, you know that it happens as well in the relationship Jacob has with his children. So, anyway, that's kind of putting a little bit of a button on that rivalry, that story, and it's important to consider as the rest of the narrative of the formation and development of the nation of Israel moves forward. We'll look at the individual names of the children, of the sons of Jacob and his wives, and kind of the significance. And we've seen already they're named based on some motivating factor, some perception their mother has at the time of the birth. We'll go back and look at that in more detail in the future. But in the subsequent chapters, Jacob has a blessing or a prophecy, really, that regards each one of his, not just his children, but their descendants, not just his sons, but their descendants. And you can say children and descendants in this context because the one daughter that we know he has doesn't have any descendants. So we have a very sad story coming up here, in the not too distant future. But anyway, so now we're going to turn back. Let's pick up in verse 25 and pick back up with this story of Jacob and Laban and their dealing. Let's read from verse 25 through verse 30 right now. Now it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me depart, for you yourself know my service which I have rendered you." But Laban said to him, "If now it pleases you, stay with me. I have divined that the Lord has blessed you, or has blessed me on your account." He continued, "Name me your wages, and I will give it." But he said to him, "You yourself know how I have served you, and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased to a multitude, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also?" So this sharp dealing, Jacob is encountering the sharp dealing Laban one more time, another battle of these desert traders and these these guys who are each looking to put one over on the other. And Laban won round one, but we're on down the road now. As I said, Jacob will triumph. He doesn't go undefeated, but he does triumph. And they're back at it again here with some negotiations. This time, really, Jacob has the upper hand because he knows what Laban is dealing with and what he has better than Laban does himself. Just as Jacob's son one day will be in the service of an Egyptian named Potiphar, and Potiphar doesn't worry about his household at all because he's got Joseph working for him, and he just turns everything over to Joseph. So Joseph knows what Laban has, or what Potiphar has, better than Potiphar does. Here, Jacob knows what Laban has better than Laban. So he's able, and he's in situation to take advantage of that, and do not think Jacob will let that advantage go unexploited. Jacob will take full advantage of that situation. He will be technically within the limits of honesty, but certainly not within the limits of perhaps honor or generosity. He will not be in the limits of generosity. And he was not treated generously either. So again, the sins of Laban are now going to be visited back upon his head. And this story gets really, I think, very sad at one point, the departure here. But now that Joseph has been born, Jacob discerns it's time to get back to Ma and Pa, my family back in the homeland, and take my favorite son away from these dealings. You see Jacob saying something that we might think, why do you even have to say, let me take my wives and children with me? I should be able, his wives and children, of course, they're going to go with him. But it's a difference between being a slave, I guess you could say, and being a hired servant. Under the Mosaic law, if when a man went to be another man's slave, the slave master might give him women from whom he will bear children, with whom he will bear children, and he will give the male slave a female slave. Maybe he's bought a tarnished daughter from another household. Maybe he has his own tarnished daughter that cannot be married based on her sexual behavior up to that point. He cannot receive the bride price for his own daughter, or perhaps he's paid and bought another man's daughter as a slave because that man could not sell her as a bride. I know these ideas and concepts are tough. I know it's difficult to think about this expectation of purity from women that simply did not exist for men. But that was the world, and that's the context in which the stories are understood, that female sexuality never belongs to the female. It always belongs to a male somewhere. And in this case, fathers or slave owners owned the sexuality of their daughters or their slaves. So perhaps in that context, a man becomes a slave under the Mosaic law to a fellow Jew. The Jew may give him female companionship from which children arise. And when the limited time for a male to serve, 6 years, is up, he's getting ready to leave. If he does not want to leave his slave wife, I guess you could say, and his slave children, if he loves where he's at, he wants to remain there, he could, but he had to have his ear pierced. He had to declare to the world, I want to be with my master. I love my master. I'm his slave in perpetuity. Otherwise, if he left, that woman and her children become the property once again of the slave owner. Those are now the slave owner's children. And again, there's lots of issues with that that don't seem right and don't seem fair to us today. And I'm glad they don't seem right and don't seem fair to us. But that's the context in which these stories could be understood. And again, they're not under the law, but this story was originally received by people who were under the law. So for Jacob to ask Laban, let me take my wives and children with me, shows that he is ready to leave, and ultimately that he is not a slave, that these women are not the property of Laban anymore, that basically they are Jacob's property now. He has served for them. He has worked for them. They are a part of his compensation package. And that's not a real easy way of looking at it either, but that's what we're dealing with here, that this is Jacob has earned this, not as a slave, but as a hired hand. This is his wages, part of his wages. And Laban is able to delay Jacob's departure. he's able to make a deal and keep Jacob around a while longer. But it will be a costly deal for Laban. And it's certainly no more just for the wives and kids. Jacob's got those. They're his. So whatever he get now, that's his severance package. That's his compensation. That's money in his pocket. And Jacob knows how to get money into his pocket. And so that's what's happening as we go forward. So let's read the last 12 verses or so of Genesis chapter 30, and then we'll talk about those. Again, if you have any comments, just drop them in the comment section there, and I'll try to respond to them. If you have a question, ask it, and maybe I'll be able to answer it. Who knows? Verse 31. Laban is speaking. So he said, "What shall I give you?" And Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flock. Let us pass through your entire flock today, removing from there every speckled and every spotted sheep and every black one among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later when you come concerning my wages. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among goats and black among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen." Laban said, "Good, let it be according to your word." So he removed on that day the striped and speckled male goats and all the speckled and spotted female goats, everyone everyone with white in it, and all the black ones among the sheep, and gave them into the care of his sons. And he put distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white stripes in them, exposing the white which was in the rods. He set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks and the gutters, even the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, and they mated when they came to drink. So the flocks mated by the rods, and the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the striped, and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own herds apart, and did not put them with Laban's flock. And moreover, whenever the stronger of the flock were mating, Jacob would place the rods in the side of the flock in the gutters, so that they might mate by the rods. But when the flock was feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob's. So the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. He was able to turn those goats and lambs into camels and donkeys. If that's not magic, I don't know what is. It's the working of the Lord, certainly. But we have what are kind of some strange and mysterious animal husbandry tactics by Jacob, with the peeling of the bark of the rods and placing of the sheep in certain ways and all of that. It's not so much a question of whether or not this was magically effective or anything like that, as it is done with a specific intent. There's no indication here that God told Jacob to do this. Jacob believed it would bring about a result, and it does bring out the result of creating the coats on the newborn animals that make them the property of Jacob rather than the property of Laban. And his flocks are strong and healthy and valuable, and while Laban's flocks become weaker and less valuable and less numerous. So it's not so much that this is how you bring about this result. It's not like if you tried to do this today, you would get this result. I'm not saying you wouldn't, because I don't know that much about sheep and goats, but I don't think it would have much impact on the coats that the animal is born. And nowhere does it say that God told him to do this, but Jacob does it. And just as God has done so far and will continue to do in this story, he takes the efforts and the constructions of human beings and redeems them, whether or not they're actually effective, whether or not they're actually pleasing to God. God redeems them, meaning more than just forgives them, he makes them effective to carry out his will. God doesn't want Jacob to price gouge Esau. God doesn't want Jacob to lie to his father and steal Esau's blessing. Jacob does those things, God uses them for the good. He takes those things. God doesn't want Abraham lying to Pharaoh. Abraham does. God uses it to bless Abraham. God doesn't want Abraham lying again about his wife. He doesn't want Isaac lying about his wife. He doesn't want the sinful behavior that we see these characters commit repeatedly. But God takes their sinful acts and redeems them and uses them to accomplish his will. God didn't want us to nail Jesus to the cross. How could he ever want that? It is, in a sense, the plan in the big scheme of things. I guess you could say it's part of the plan that Jesus would be the sacrifice, and that way a physical living, a sacrifice of a living being that is whose life is taken. But at the same time, Jesus offers the opportunity to honor, obey, and worship God in a way that's consistent with God's intentions all along. Just as if you look at, again, I think maybe the clearest example of this is the story of God's interaction with Pharaoh during the time of Moses, where God uses the sin of Pharaoh to accomplish his own will. And the sin of Pharaoh is created by God giving Pharaoh opportunities to obey him. God gives Pharaoh every chance to obey him, knowing Pharaoh will not obey him. His heart gets harder. The Egyptian nation ultimately pushes Israel homeward rather than just allowing them to go. They are pushed out. Pharaoh pursues with his army, and they're destroyed. But God uses sinful acts of humans redemptively to accomplish his will. And again, redemption is not directly tied exclusively to forgiveness, and perhaps doesn't even involve forgiveness, but God takes our junk and makes treasure out of it. God takes your garbage and gives you gold. That's kind of how God works, at least at times in his dealings with human. He calls for obedience, but he can take our disobedience and still bring about his will. That's how great God personally is, and that's how great his plan. His plan is kind of almost presupposes, almost based upon, almost dependent upon human disobedience rather than human obedience. If everybody just did what God wanted all the time, it would be a very different world. Maybe a better one, but a different one for sure. I guess it would definitely be a better one. But the fact is, humans are not always going to obey God, and God knows this, and his plans work through our disobedience, in spite of our disobedience, transcending our disobedience. One of the things that's interesting about this story, I think, is that Jacob basically says his word is his honor. Let's see. Verse 33 of our reading. So my honesty will answer for me later. I'm going to give you my word, my solemn word, and you'll be able to verify it later. But here's the offer I'm making to you, and you can take me at my word. Jacob is not a man to be taken at his word. There is no reason for anybody to take Jacob at his word. We saw some of Abraham's neighbors not really willing to take Abraham at his word. So these guys, you can't really do that. And this, again, putting it in the context of the teachings of Jesus, when Jesus talks about saying, let your yes be yes and your no be no, he is talking about daily interactions. He's talking about the deals people make in a culture that did not condemn deceit the way we, at some level, condemn it. I mean, we tend to kind of overlook it when we do it or when somebody we like, and we hate it when someone else does it. But it was an art, an admired art form in this context to induce reliance upon assertions. To tell somebody this is what you're going to do in a way that you could not do it, but still get the benefit of your bargain and still leave the other person with no recourse. To defraud, to make an oath on the altar, but not the sacrifice on the altar, to find some technicality. And I know lawyers get accused of this all the time, and sometimes they're guilty of it. And sometimes what you can find in court and what's really required is to kind of try to carry out the intention of the agreement, regardless of some technicalities. If some technicalities aren't met, then so be it. And then if other technicalities are met, then that's fine. So there was this design to create technicalities that would have induced confidence. He is conning Laban. He's creating unmerited confidence in Laban that will ultimately be violated, while leaving Laban no recourse. See, I kept my word. There's nothing you can do. This is what I said. And yet the outcome clearly was a result of manipulation, clearly a result of deceit. And it's not honest. It really isn't honest. And Jesus is saying, when he says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, he's saying, don't play that game. Don't play the game of trying to deceive eloquently, to create false expectations of confidence, to get off of your obligations on technicalities that you yourself construed. Say yes and let it mean yes. Say no and let it mean no. Let your honesty truly be, what did you say? Masi will answer for me. Let your honesty be your answer in a way that people know, that they don't have to parse, disseminate, dissect every agreement and go through it with a fine-tooth comb, bring in the lawyers every single time, and try to make sure that the assertions you're making are actually binding. Bind yourself by your honesty. Bind yourself by your integrity, and follow through with those commitments. And certainly there are times when it's not to say that you can't ever break a contract. It's not to say that in that concept, Jesus even says, if you find yourself in a bind, go to your contract partner, basically, go to that person, work a deal out, find something, to kind of make the deal renegotiate or something like that. If you're a surety for others, go and, of course, that's more of a proverb, go and get yourself out of that rather than be a surety. But hi, Mindy. Good to see you. So just be this thoroughly honest person upon whom people can rely, and let it be at that. And what harmony and what peace that a community, a culture experiences when people, when they give their word, they do everything they reasonably can to keep that word. They may even go above and beyond the bounds of reasonableness. But if you have people who, when they give their word, do everything they reasonably can to keep their word, and the people they make those arrangements with come into it with an ethos, with an expectation and an understanding and an empathy that, sometimes circumstances arise that preclude the completion of a deal. They can't keep their word. If someone says, I will see you, I'll meet you for lunch at Andre's on Thursday. Andre's Kitchen here in Walla Walla. I'm going to meet you there for lunch on Thursday. And they fully intend to do that. And then the state government steps in and says, restaurants are closed, no dine in, all you can have is takeout and delivery. And the person hears that and figures, well, we can't meet for lunch, so he doesn't even show up. And the other person goes there expecting the other person to show up. Some people might say, well, you said you would be there. Well, he did say he would be there, but also the governor said there's no point in showing up. So, if we come into it with honesty and integrity on both sides, and then when there is a dispute and a misunderstanding and a dysfunction in a relationship of some kind, it can be resolved peacefully and honorably for both parties. And that's the goal. That's the ethic. That's the result Jesus is striving for. Whereas the culture, in part because of these types of stories, in part because of the complexities, I guess you could say, of the law of Moses, but just in part because of the nature of humanity, is to always try to get one up on someone else. And in this culture, certainly honor was as good as money. They wanted to be honored as much as they wanted to be paid. In America, we're not so much worried about honor. We just want to get paid. You can dishonor me all you want as long as you pay me for it. The only dishonor in America is to not have any money. So there's a few other dishonors, but that's the big one, not having any money. But in this culture, honor was just as much a commodity as money. And Jacob is maneuvering and acting in a way to extract not just Laban's financial wealth, but to come out of it honored above Laban, to be avenged of the deceit at the wedding night when he thinks Rachel, but ends up married to Leah. He's getting his revenge. He's also triumphing. He's going to win. And we see it playing out already in the effects of Jacob's manipulation of the flocks, that the flocks are becoming more and more his, and his are stronger and healthier. His are more valuable. His wealth is on the waxing. It's growing. It's increasing. And Laban's wealth is waning. It's decreasing. He's getting weaker and weaker. And Laban doesn't really even see this happening because he is at this point, kind of a gentleman farmer. He owns the crops. He owns the land, but he's letting someone else take care of it. And that is usually not a real good way to run your business. That is not a good way to run your farm. I had a very good friend who's passed away several years ago now. He was trying to run a commercial fishing operation and tried to retire and stay owning the fishing business, and it didn't work out too well for him. Very good, honest, decent man, and found out that not everybody you deal with in the fishing business is good and decent and honorable. He found out the hard way and found it out late in life, unfortunately. But this is a culture in which Jesus is born into. And although this is a long time before the birth of Jesus, cultures did not change that much back then. And maybe today they haven't really changed that much from then to now. But Jesus is born into a culture of the acquisition of wealth and honor with pretty aggressive means. And Jesus calls upon his followers, his people, to reject that culture. He offers a counter to the culture. And that counter is to be a decent, honorable person, to be satisfied with what God gives you, that God will give you enough. And, people around the world right now that are following God, some of them do not have enough. They do not have what they need to meet the requirements of a human being on a daily basis. That is not because God hasn't given to them. That is because humanity is so tragically broken that it is being intercepted, that humans are taking from other humans. Again, much like this. So when we act selfishly, when we act according to our own wisdom and for our own desires, we frustrate the will of God, but only for a time. Ultimately, God's will prevail. Ultimately, Laban's deceit is the core deceit, this dispute, and ultimately God will turn the tables, and he's already doing it, and elevating the one who was originally harmed by the deceit. Jacob it's hard to see him in this way sometimes, but here he's the victim, the world is being turned upside down. The day of the Lord is coming, and God is lifting up the downtrodden, lifting up the oppressed, and advocating for the exploited. So this is what's happening. This is what's in the works. And Jacob has become very wealthy, very powerful, and he's got to now extricate himself with this wealth, with his family intact, with his money intact, with his animals. He's got to. Sometimes the hardest thing is to get out of town, and he's got to try to get out of town. And we will look at that next week as we get into chapter 31, Lord willing. Before we go, let's have a word of prayer, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. Father, we're so thankful for all that you have done for us. Father, may we look at these stories and not try to justify deceit and sharp dealing, but see why you do not want us to be deceitful, sharp dealing people. Why you want us to know that and to be people whose yes means yes and whose no means no. People of decency and integrity in our communities. Father, we know that all families are comprised of humans and therefore have their own flaws. Help us be humble enough to confess and repent and try to grow through our flaws. Help us forgive the flaws, the harm we received from our families of origin. Help us transcend those flaws and hurts in the administration of our own nuclear families. Help us if we think we were cursed. Help us bless in the way in which we were cursed. Forgive us of our sins, Father, as we go forward into the rest of this week. Bring us back Sunday morning. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay. Have a good rest of your week.